Welcome. Today we're going to hear from Jessica Starr and Ben Maggs about what it's like being rare book dealers in London. This is the Book Club of Washington's second program this year from England. In February, we heard from Ross King talk about his latest book, The Bookseller of Florence, a program which we did jointly with the Book Club of California. It was terrific. The power of Zoom has enabled us to get presenters and attract audiences from around the world to our events this year. Today we have 53 registered, and I'm the one that has to kind of monitor the waiting room. So excuse me for a second. And so of the 53, we're broken down about equally between members of the Book Club of Washington and those who are not yet members. We will get a glimpse behind the scene of the London rare book trade from one of London's young power couples, at least in the rare book world. They met at the University of London while both working on MAs in book history. Jessica did an internship at Jarndyce, which turned into a permanent position, and Ben joined the family firm. I'd like to say a few words of introduction about each of our speakers, but before that, I would like to thank a book club board member, Tamara Belts, for bringing Jess and Ben to our attention. She met them earlier this year at a reception hosted by Maggs Brothers for attendees of the London Rare Book School, which she was of which she attended. And as she heard, I think Ben, she heard you talk there, or maybe both of you. I'm not. So anyway, she thought you guys would be great to hear from, and we are delighted that both of you are with us here today. So a few words about Jessica. She joined Jarndyce Antiquarian Booksellers. I assume that there's some Dickensian reference to Jarndyce. As a lawyer, I'm particularly susceptible. I don't say suspicious. Anyway, that name does resonate with me a bit in Jarndyce v. Jarndyce. Anyway, as an intern in the summer of 2015, you've done a lot of cataloging there, I understand. Yes, I see 5,000 pamphlets from 1630 to 1930, over a 300-year span. 18th century novels, Vindicicli, the Romantic period, 17th and 18th century books and manuscripts. So you've really had to cover a lot of the territory, I assume, that's covered, that is the inventory of your venerable, wonderful bookstore. You have an MA in history from the University of London, a BA in English literature from University of British Columbia. So you spent some time out in our neck of the woods. Wonderful. Yeah. And MI, I'm not sure what an MI is, Master of
Information, Library and Information Science.
Yes, in Library and Information Science, yes, from the University of Toronto. You're particularly interested in modern cheap print and manuscript, especially 17th century strange news and the English Civil War. Wonderful. One of our presenters earlier this year, Art Sato, is going to write an article on 19th century street literature. So you may be interested in it's whatever he has, what he comes up with. He's a professor at a university in Toronto. Ben, I understand you joined Maggs Brothers in 2013 and have worked on a number of projects, including a collection of Chinese opium pipes, a set of Sangorski and Sutcliffe fine bindings, one of the great binding firms. And you now work in the modern department, focusing on private press works and your interest in the golden age of science fiction and the theory and practice of bookmaking, past, present, and future. And you're working toward your MA in book history at University of London's School of Advanced Study.
Well, this actually, I must interject to say this was me not updating my bio, which I have now done. Jess and I met on the master's course at the University of London, so that dates
about 9 years ago.
Yes.
So a while, yeah.
So I am a graduate. I don't have an undergraduate degree, but I do have a master's degree, which puts me into a select club.
Well, thanks for those clarifications. Wouldn't want to exaggerate or misstate anything. So you did miss we had a program. Our last program was in fact by a dealer in science fiction. It has one of the largest inventories of science fiction located in Richland, Washington, where our nuclear works were done in World War II. So anyway, you might want to catch his presentation, but it was quite enjoyable. Before we get started, one other thing, I just wanted to report some exciting news for our book club as a result of our really terrific programming this year, our outstanding journal, and the booth at our Antiquarian Book Fair. We've added 20 new members in the past month, which is pretty remarkable for a club that now has 131 members. So that's a almost 20% increase. And we have around 500 on our wider distribution lists, which is, so we've been able to actually prosper during the shutdown, and I'm looking forward to actually having some events in person this next year. But in the meantime, we've been delighted to be able to have these remote events and have speakers like Jess and Ben. So I'm going to ask people to hold their questions to the end. We have a chat room. You can put them in there. I see a few more people for me to admit. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jess and Ben. And thank you, guys.
Well, thank you very much for having us, all of you. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually. Jess and I come to you like the Dickensian ghosts. I will be the ghost of Christmas past, and Jess will be the ghost of Christmas present. And perhaps together we can be the ghost of the future yet to be. So we're going to put on a wee slideshow. I'm going to talk through the history of Maggs Brothers, and Jess will talk through some of the realities of being a bookseller today. And following that, we will be very happy to answer some questions. We don't get to do a lot of these Zoom things, so I'm just going to try pressing the share screen button, and hopefully I will make it work. Can you see this slideshow?
Yeah, it looks great.
Wonderful. So I'll kick things off with a quote from my dad, which because we've been, Maggs began in 1853, and with that comes a certain burden of history, and it's easy to get carried away by it. My dad was interviewed in 2015 by Rare Book Hub, and they asked something about how does it feel to be the fifth generation of the Maggs family, and he responded with this wonderful quote: "What has posterity ever done for us? That's what I want to know. A distinguished history is a wonderful thing, but it can be a knife with no handle, especially if you are seduced by it into thinking that you have some sort of special right to success. The vanity of the old established firm and consequent smugness is a terrifying vision for me." And so whenever I come to think and talk about the history of the firm, I hear my dad's voice in my back of my head warning me not to get carried away. And it's worth saying that many firms have come and gone in our time. Somebody came into the shop yesterday who's whose relative had passed away at the age of 94 and had bought books for all of his life, and he'd recommended that they come to Mags and to Bertram Rota. And Bertram Rota ceased trading about 20 years ago. And so I sort of had to break it to this gentleman. I'm very sorry that you won't be able to go and visit them. And that's common in the trade. It is ephemeral, and it always has been for printers and publishers. We have this way of making ourselves seem very grand at the time, and you might look back at the works of a publisher, and they seem so monumental, but only 5 or 10 years later, they're old-fashioned and they've been usurped by something new, and all that's left is the remains, the printed heritage. So we begin as a firm in roughly 1853. The state of our archives are evident in that we're not quite sure what year we began. But we do know that Uriah, the gentleman on the right here, came to London in 1850. And he was part of a large influx of people from the rural regions of Britain. Economic times were difficult in the mid-19th century. Uriah came from a small town called Midsummer Norton, which is near the Mendip Hills in the West Country. And our name means son of Margaret. It's a matronymic name, which is unusual and is very localized to this town. And if you search for this town now, I did last year, I found David Maggs, who had been arrested for assaulting a police officer. So that's the family who stayed. And not to be confused also with the singer-songwriter Benjamin Maggs, who is a very handsome guitarist who looks not dissimilar from me, but is in no relation as far as I know. And I'm sure he's a better guitar player than I am. But on the left is something I discovered a few months ago in a dealer's catalogue, which is the autobiography of somebody called George Mitchell, who left his birthplace, a town called Montacute, just around the corner, also in 1850, to travel to London. And he established himself in London as a great stonemason, but also an important anarchist politician. And he printed this broadside and posted it around the towns in the West Country, attacking the wealthy landowners who were working the tenant farmers literally to the bone. And you can imagine this image being posted to town halls. It was a pretty radical statement for the time. And so their paths were fairly similar in that Uriah came to London and began as a butler to a gentleman called Barnard van Oven, who was an important surgeon living at number 30 Gower Street. This is just at the top of Bedford Square, slightly north of Bedford Square, and it's where the School of Tropical Hygiene and Medicine is now. And remember Bedford Square. We will come back to it later. The site of our first shop was 44 Westbourne Terrace North. And like migrants of all times, Uriah didn't get far from his port of entry. This is near to Paddington Station, and it's now underneath the Westway, which is probably the ugliest motorway flyover in Britain. It's the great inspiration for J.G. Ballard's novel Crash, these horrific dystopian fictions. And in the 1850s, late 19th century, it wasn't much better. Charles Booth visited the street in 1898, and he declared the area, quote, as having better houses than people, a good mixture of prostitutes, brothels and Delamere Crescent. That's the only entry it got. The classic crime drama, The Blue Lamp, is one of the first films not shot on a studio, shot actually in the streets. And it was filmed 1 or 2 years before they knocked all of this area down. It's a fascinating insight into a bit of Victorian slum that you never otherwise get to see. The photo on the right is the only photo I've been able to find in archives of Westbourne Terrace. The numbering isn't clear, but one of these, possibly at the far end, is where mags were. On the left is the earliest piece of ephemera that we have from the company. It was actually given to us by a customer who discovered it pasted down to the front board of a book, of a triple-decker, I think. And with a slight horror, we received the knowledge that he'd torn the board off and sent it to us on its own, leaving, I suppose, the book sort of bereft. Like many booksellers of the time, we had a circulating library, and we also seem to have had a bindery. We have one volume, sort of in heavy brown Morocco, with this Mags binder stamp, but most likely that was subcontracted out. Something very interesting about this is that you're always learning, always discovering new things. And my dad came to me once with a lovely book, a little ephemeral thing, but an off-print from The Wind in the Willows. It's just one chapter, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which is a particularly beautiful and pagan hymn to nature. And he'd always loved this little thing, and it has this great distinction of being the only other thing printed by Manning Pike, who otherwise achieved the Seven Pillars of Wisdom, the subscribers edition of T. Lawrence's magnum opus. And this gentleman was a fascinating character from Texas, walked around London with a Stetson hat and cowboy pistols, and when he got excited about something, would take his pistols out and shoot them in the air, like all the stereotypes. And he seems to have run a press pressing medals, celebratory medals. Quite how or why T. Lawrence chose him to print this astonishingly complicated book isn't entirely clear. There are some fascinating books. A Shy Bird is a wonderful book about the publication history of the Seven Pillars. But Manning Pike couldn't have been much more disorganized than Lawrence himself, who left the original manuscript on a train. And that's one of the great mysteries of the British Rail Lost Property Office. Will that one day appear? But anyway, that's tangential, which is to say what we hadn't realized. My dad has always loved this book, and we hadn't realized, we just hadn't looked at the colophon, that it was printed at 44 Westbourne Terrace North, the same address as our first shop, 50 years later. But this is also where bits of the Seven Pillars were printed. My father has specialised for most of his working career in Lawrence and in the Seven Pillars. And so it was an astonishing roundabout thing to think that Uriah's first shop, 50 years later, T.E. Lawrence would drive down on his Bruff motorbike and he would sleep in the basement, lying on top of these pipes with central heating to keep warm. You're never, it seems in London especially, more than sort of one step away from your ancestors or your heroes. This is the only photo I've been able to find of our shop in Paddington, Church Street. So this would have been the 1880s. It gives you a really interesting insight into a very stodgy, but quite serious antiquarian bookshop. This is a sort of higher class version of what's his name's shop from Riceyman Steps. We go from there, and this tells you about how we're doing. Paddington Church Street was pretty good, but Paddington, the whole area, that's why it was knocked down for the Westway. It was always quite run down, as areas near train stations are. And we, in 1901, moved to the Strand, 109, which this was the height of it as a fashionable area. It was the fashionable street in London. We were a few doors down from the Savoy Hotel and almost next door to the astonishing Simpsons in the Strand. Again, there's no photographs of this building that I've been able to find. This photo, though, shows the view north, going up Burleigh Street. And I suspect this could have been taken from the first floor of our shop. it would be exactly the right address. And so it gives you an idea of what in 1910 the Maggs family would have looked at as they catalogued. It's worth mentioning Simpsons in the Strand because one couldn't imagine a more fitting venue for antiquarian booksellers and indeed for authors as well. It was one of the few things in Britain that united people from all walks of life. The most decadent aesthetes to the most conservative politicians all dined here in the most old-fashioned domed roast beef table service. You have people like Gladstone, Disraeli, Anthony Powell, and the great beast, Alistair Crowley. They all love to dine here. And there's a wonderful story about Crowley sitting to dinner with his mother and looking at the menu, and you can imagine him, "Oh, mother, you can have boiled toads." And it appears in Sherlock Holmes, of course. When we have finished at the police station, I think that something nutritious at Simpsons would not be out of place. And we were 2 doors down from this, and it's hard to believe that any work got done between the hours of about 11 and 4 o'clock. I imagine that there was probably only the intern left at the front desk in the shop. We moved from there to Conduit Street, which, in this incredible coup of interior design, each room was themed, like this old English game show called The Crystal Maze. I saw Sandy Malcolm in the waiting area earlier, so he might get this as an Englishman, but others might not. We had the medieval book chamber, we had a chained library, we had an astonishing Art Deco room, and all the furniture was made for us. And this all stays with us today. We have all of these objects still in our building. That bookshelf is in our new building now. And we put out these astonishing catalogues, astonishingly cool. The typography is fascinating. You can get, we have put out more than 1,500 catalogues now, and there is a study just in its own right of our own typography, not particularly accomplished, but very practical and workmanlike. So this brings us on to, during our time in Conduit Street, we moved there in 1918, and we were there until 1935 or so. And it was during this time that we achieved our most significant bookselling accomplishment, which relates to this monastery in the Sinai Desert, St. Catherines. When I was studying at the University of London, our teacher, Michelle Brown, in the medieval books course, would fly in from St. Catherines Monastery. She was there working on the paleography, and she would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm half an hour late for your lecture. I've just got off the plane from the Sinai." This makes bibliography seem perhaps slightly more exciting than it really is. But it was in 1931 that Ernest Maggs, the son of Uriah, and his colleague Maurice Ettinghausen, who ran our Paris branch, and with whom we later fell out. It's interesting reading his own autobiography, where he never mentions Maggs by name. He only calls them that bookseller that wronged me. And we're still not entirely sure what that wronging was, but it was clearly unforgivable. It's complicated. He was Jewish. Oh, okay. So it's possible that we,
oh dear.
There's stuff to discover there. But yeah, so in 1931 we went to the Soviet Union, to Leningrad, on a book buying expedition. The Soviet government was desperately short on cash, and Ettinghausen later claimed that he only survived by eating tin sardines he'd brought with him. There was nothing else to eat in the city. It was on this journey that Ernest and Maurice were able to buy a copy of the 42-line Gutenberg Bible, This has already been pre-sold to Martin Bodmer, and it was a great coup. And it's one of 2 Gutenberg Bibles that our firm has sold in our time, the other being the Dyson Perrins copy, which a few years later went to Estelle de Henny and is now in Japan. While they were there, the story goes that they walked past a manuscript in a glass case and asked about it politely. And they were told, no, it's not for sale. You never take no for an answer. And we politely said, if anything changes, just let us know. 2 years later, things had changed and they were willing to sell. This manuscript was the Codex Sinaiticus. It's one of the earliest Bible manuscripts known, circa AD 350. It was once thought to be one of the Constantine Bibles commissioned by the emperor. Now it's not entirely sure if it is, but it may or may not be. These things are complicated. But the idea that you could trace it as one of the 100 Bibles commissioned by a Roman emperor is really astonishing. It had been unearthed in the monastery by this astonishing German Bible hunter, Friedrich von Tischendorf, who, quote, persuaded the monks to let it go, to sell it to him. They, to this day, maintain that it was stolen, and it may well have been. These things are complicated, of course, and certainly money did change hands. He presented it to the Tsar of Russia, who did then pay in rubles, but not nearly what it was worth. There's a couple of stories about it. One is which he claimed to have found it in a bin in the monastery, and the other, which is rather more plausible, is that he'd spent weeks there looking for manuscripts and had found some interesting things, but nothing fantastic. And he went to speak to the gatekeeper in his cell. And the library in the monastery was a library. It's a working library. And the monks would take these manuscripts out. And the gatekeeper asked what he was here for. And he said, I'm looking for old Bibles. And the gatekeeper said, I've got one under my bed. I was reading it last night. And he pulled it out. And immediately Tischendorf knew this was it. And this does get to something about the book trade, that you do find things in unusual places. And you do have to keep digging. You have to be polite, but you do also have to be firm. And this is that, albeit on a rather grander scale. So the initial asking price from the Soviet government was £400,000 in the money of 1933. Our offer was £50,000. We were. And it's a sign of their desperation that we were then able to agree on £100,000. This was to be paid for by subscription from the British public. And this is something that the British institutions are very good at to this day. We do not, as a country, have much of a standing budget to buy things, unlike American institutions who generally have larger bequests that they can use on spec. But when we really need something in this country, we can gather donations, and members of the public are donating from 1 penny to £100, raised enough money for the British Museum to purchase this. And this is a photo of Ernest Maggs himself delivering the manuscript. And I'm going to play you a short film. Hopefully this will work. As I click on it, let's see. I may need to change the sharing, but this is a newsreel footage of Ernest delivering the manuscript to the British. Okay, so I'm going to press the Zoom share, and hang on, I'm going to move you to Safari. There we go. That's it. And go back to the start. And full screen.
casually wrapped in paper the manuscript of the earliest known copy of the Bible, the Codex
I should ask, can you hear this? Good.
leaves the Russian trade delegation offices on its way to the British Museum. Mr. Maggs with the beard follows his trophy into the car. He has been the chief negotiator in the purchase of the Bible from the Soviet. Although apparently unguarded, detectives with their hands significantly placed in their pockets surround the bearers of the 100,000-pound volume, which is then introduced to the cameras by Mr. Maggs.
It is most appropriate at this festive season of the year that the most important manuscript of the most important book in the world, the Bible, should find a permanent home in the British Museum. And it has given me the greatest thrill possible to know that I have helped bring this about. Ever since I saw it in Russia some 2 years ago, it has been my wish to see it in London. And now, after strenuous efforts, this has been fulfilled. The fine page. Yeah. Venom. Beautiful, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, it's very beautiful venom. Oh, yeah.
Jess and I are both giggling about that because the conversation that they're having is identical to conversations you will overhear in any auction viewing room today. Beautiful vellum, lovely vellum, jolly good, yes. So that it's funny, you watch other people do this and it always seems to be harder than it looks, and it really is. Now, where has that's Safari? Get rid of Safari. We want to go back to Keynote, which there we go. Okay, can you see the slideshow again? Good. Is this doing that? I don't know. Hang on. It's just making a weird noise. Hang on. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay, that's back. Okay. No, we can get that back. Okay. And we do that. There we go. Share screen again. Back to Keynote. Okay.
We work with old books, not new technology. Yes. So this is sometimes a bit
yeah. I hope this is the authentic experience. So to wrap things up, we moved in 38 or so, or just before the war, we moved to Barkley Square. It was jolly good business because we had been planning to demolish the Conduit Street shop and rebuild it, and were to be hit by quite a big bill for demolishing it. And then the Luftwaffe dropped a bomb on it, which was very convenient. So we didn't have to pay, and we moved into this building. And then fast forward to the present day, where we have two shops. We have a shop in Conduit Street, in Curzon Street in Mayfair, and on the left is Bedford Square. And I mentioned that earlier. We've come full circle. Without intending to, we've returned to the site of Uriah's first position in London. And this is, it's funny, I like this photo, but all the staff at Mags hate it because I think booksellers absolutely hate sort of the sight of themselves in the mirror. We're like vampires in many ways. So that's my talk about the history of Mags. And the next slide will take on to Jess.
Yes. So Ben got into the book trade through this amazing, long-standing family route, and my route into the book trade was somewhat more circuitous. I'm from a really small town in Northern Ontario in Canada, and I don't know, I think I was going to be like a sport fishing guide or a rare book dealer probably from day one. Those were the directions my life were heading in. So I think the wheels started turning towards book dealer when I was at UBC. I lived in Vancouver for years. I loved it. My best friend's from Seattle, so I spent a lot of time there as well. And one day at the Irving Library, UBC has a great rare books library, but they didn't have a folio. And they had one in my maybe final year on loan from an institution in California, either UCLA or the Huntington, I think. And we got to go into the rare books library and we saw a first folio. And it was a very sort of white glove affair. Obviously, we couldn't touch it. But I was kind of awed by being in a room with this item that represents so much of history. You know, it survived 400 years. Next year, 2023, it was printed in 1623, and it's just a beautiful book. It's really well printed, and I'm an early modernist, so I'm a big Shakespeare fan. So I was kind of blown away. So I left UBC, I finished my undergrad, and I went and worked up north in Haida Gwaii at a fishing lodge. But after a little break from academia, I went back to the University of Toronto to do an MLIS, a Master's in Library and Information Science at U of T. And I arrived at a really interesting time there because Richard Landon, who was a great librarian at Toronto, had died about a year before, but his legacy in the library, he really took the Fisher from like a good Canadian collection to one of the best rare book libraries in the world. And so the librarians at Toronto really loved booksellers in a way that maybe not all institutions do. And so there were lots of bookselling catalogs around, and people were sort of talking to them and talking about them. And so when I graduated and was applying for special collections jobs, I kind of said to my mentor at the time that, I thought librarianship sounded really interesting and fun, but like maybe something was missing. And so he said, why don't you go to London? Maybe you should be a bookseller. So, yeah. So I arrived in London. I met Ben in a digital books class, I think. He always says we met sort of, in a roundabout way through bibliography.
I arrived late.
He arrived late. He was eating a potato salad. It was a whole thing. But anyway, we met at the University of London when I was doing the MA in book history. And at the end of the MA, there was an option to do an internship, and I interned at Jarndyce. And I interned for was meant to be 2 months, and then they were like, well, maybe you could just intern until your visa's up. And then they hired me part-time, and then after about 10 months I was hired full-time, and I've been there ever since. So the best part about being a bookseller is that no days are the same. You never know what's going to cross your desk. You never know who you're going to meet. You never know where you're going to end up, which can be really glamorous and it can be really grim. It just depends on the day. So it's just a really mixed bag. So the photos on the screen now, Jarndyce is right around the corner from Meg's at Bedford Square. We're on Great Russell Street, which is right across from the British Museum, which you can see right there. And our building was built in about 1720, so we do have a lot, and we have some of the original interiors, so we do get a lot of filming at Jarndyce. So this was the pictures on the screen now were when they filmed some scenes from The Electrical Life of Louis Wain starring Benedict Cumberbatch at Jarndyce in 2019 maybe. And so we staged the shop as a sort of 1890s bookshop for them. So it was a lot of our books kind of fit the bill. And then you can see at the bottom image on the right, they had sort of created these dummy copies of The War of the Worlds and Time Machine. That's obviously not, the colors are kind of right, but that's not the right size of the books. Any book person will know. And then the center image is that's Nick Cave. He was playing H.G. Wells. I think the scene was maybe cut, but anyway, so sometimes days are like that. Yes, as Greg said at the beginning, I do spend a lot of time cataloging. My first project at Jarndyce was a collection of 5,000 pamphlets. It took me about a year of doing kind of 2 or 3 days a week to catalog. It was incredibly interesting. It makes you learn a lot about a lot over a period of time. The catalog on the left is the last big catalog I did independently, which was a turn of the century catalog, which was very fun. But really, as I said, I'm an early modernist. So my favorite thing that I've ever sold is on the bottom right. And it's a pamphlet about a sort of 17th century Bonnie and Clyde and how they were captured and ultimately executed. But this was from 1635, and it was sewn as issued in its original wrappers. It had survived perfectly as just this like bit of paper. It was absolutely amazing. In the middle, a true account of the piracies. That's an unrecorded pamphlet about piracy from about 1716, so golden age. The letter on the top right is a really sweet letter from a young Scottish man, sort of minor aristocrat, who was in Paris in the 1830s. And he talks about going to the trial of some people who had tried to execute or assassinate the king and things. And he talks about going to gaming hells and kind of living this life, but really he's sending this letter home to his mum to say, Mum, actually, I could use with maybe a bit more cash, if you wouldn't mind. So, nothing changes. So those are some sort of fun cataloging projects. Right now, I have just finished a series of 4 catalogs on the Romantic period and the Romantic background with a colleague. Our latest catalog has about 950 items, so that's going to come out in February, I think. And then my next project is mystery and detective fiction and early sci-fi, so excited for that. One of my favorite things to do as a bookseller is to go to book fairs, and hopefully lots of you have been to book fairs. The Seattle Book Fair wasn't that long ago, I don't think, about a month ago. At Jarndyce, we're quite small. We're a team of 8, but we do quite a few book fairs. We do New York, California, London, Oxford, Cambridge, Brighton, Edinburgh, York, Bristol. I think there's more, I can't really remember. And they're really great and fun. They're a great way to meet customers and to meet other dealers and to sort of figure out I feel like you often see things displayed in book fairs in such a way that kind of makes you think differently about them and makes you put them in a different context, which can be really helpful when you're sort of buying or when you're looking to start collecting. I think book fairs are really a really great place to start. Another sort of perk of the job is library visits. So I deal a lot with institutional customers. As Ben kind of touched on earlier, British institutions are great, but the really big collections here are based on deposit schemes that have been going for a long time. So Oxford's been a deposit library since the 14th century. So they have a lot of stuff, as do Cambridge and the BL and Edinburgh and Wales have so much stuff. So I have lots of good American library customers, and it's really fun because then when you travel, you get to go visit these places. So I'm sure everyone knows the Peabody in Baltimore on the left and the Morgan on the right. And a really fun thing about being a dealer is that you often sort of get kind of quite good access to these places, often after hours, which is a good perk, or tours with curators and stuff, which is really fun. The left is the Beinecke, the middle is Trinity Fellows Library at Oxford, and the right is the Library of Congress. That collection of pamphlets that I spent so long on, 5,000 pamphlets, actually sold to the Library of Congress, which was a real high point in my career. Because it was such a great home for it. And then we got to go visit them, which was very, very cool as well. So that's some of the glamorous parts of bookselling. But there's lots of other bits that there's a lot of heavy lifting involved. You can see in the Shelving New Catalogs, that was a language and dictionary catalog that we put out earlier this year. And the bottom shelf, you can't really get a sense of the scale, but the bottom shelf are all folio. Those are Johnson folios. So, they're sort of, I don't know, they weigh 8 pounds each or something, absolutely massive, moving them around. We are quite a collaborative business. So you can see a lot of my colleagues standing around the computer, one of them on the phone and the others yelling what they think we should pay for something at auction. We have lots of good relationships with customers, but sometimes that means going into places to clean out, you want to help people out. So we get called in to clean out books that are moldy or destroyed or otherwise in sort of rough conditions. So that's another aspect of the job that is slightly less glamorous. But yeah, also last year I did the Jarndyce calendar, which was very fun. We did a sort of shelfy one. So lots of planning, again, moving books around to try to curate that. And then in the summer, I co-curated an exhibition with some of, that's at Mags, with some of Ben's colleagues and some other colleagues from Peter Harrington's, of a really wonderful forgotten feminist author, Dorothy Whipple. So real mixed bag. And then I thought I would talk a little bit about what I've been doing most recently. So these photos were taken last week, and it's an interesting project for us. We actually don't own this collection, but we're selling it on behalf of a good customer and friend of ours. And the collection is called, it is sold, but it's called Books as They Were Published. And so the collection is from 1790 until 1940, books in the original condition. There's about 2,500 items, ranging from, tiny almanac calendars to newspapers to broadsides and slip songs and ephemera. And so I spent last week working 10 hours a day checking off the catalog, because the woman who put it together didn't catalog or list it. She just took photos of it and described them, because it's a teaching collection. So it was quite, I've never done that before. It was quite an interesting process. They were all mixed together. So it was also a good refresher of book history to put things back in place and figure out, like, no, that's purple cloth is definitely 1860s, kind of, it's like a little puzzle. And I just thought it was quite moving. The bottom right is a copy of the Daily Mail from VE Day, which is an amazing thing to pull out of a box and hold in your hand, quite sort of moving. So that's an example of, we sell quite a lot of collections, and I know Tamara knows, we've actually known Tamara for years, and Jarndyce works in quite a specific way, because we create these huge catalogs, subject catalogs, and so we spend years, sometimes decades, collecting material before we sell them. So it's a bit of a joke with other dealers that a lot of our books actually aren't for sale, because we take a long time to put them together. But we do work a lot with collections like this, which is another interesting kind of difference of what we do, but is also very fun, but very time consuming as well. And then I just thought this is a fun thing to show. So the first time I saw a first folio, I'm 19 or whatever, and I'm not allowed to touch it, and I'm not really allowed to go near it. And right before COVID, we were on the East Coast before the New York Book Fair, when we went to visit the Library of Congress to visit the pamphlets, and we stopped by the Free Library of Philadelphia. And I said to the curator at the time, God, I would love to see Milton's folio. And she was like, yeah, no problem. And this is really the best thing about being a book dealer, is she just handed it to me, and I just got to flip through. So the middle image is Milton's, or it's widely thought that it's Milton's annotations on his Shakespeare First Folio. And the folio obviously doesn't have the prologue for Romeo and Juliet, so he has filled it in his very distinct hand. And there's some more annotations to that volume on the left. And on the right is another document from the Free Library of Philadelphia. a lot of my master's research is in witch trials, and actually British witch trials, Scottish and English in particular. But this is a document from Salem, which is signed by John Hawthorne and has the mark of Abigail Hobbs, who was the youngest accused at Salem. And again, just handed to me like, oh, I think you'll think this is interesting, have a look. And so, yeah, I think ultimately that's sort of the sweet spot of being a bookseller, is that it's quite a dirty job, I think, dirtier than some people might think, and a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of dusty books, but the perks definitely outweigh it. So that's all we have for our slideshow, I think. And I know we sort of build that we would talk about collecting and the way to work with dealers in collections. But I think the best way to do that is for us to answer questions if anyone has any. Book dealers, yeah, we sort of do, we do everything. We provide all sorts of book related services, whether you're just starting, you're thinking about what you want to collect, like across all price points. We're happy to talk about anything. So yeah, I think maybe best to open it up.
Yeah. And I might start with an anecdote just briefly, because and one of the things that I find very important is to stress that the joy of collecting, the thrill of collecting, I don't think is directly connected to the money, or that's one of the thrills, but it's not the main thrill. The thrill is research, study, hard work, identifying, and then that shock of discovery and love. And when my ideal book fair is going through a whole book fair and only finding one book that I want to buy, but there's no question I have to buy that book because I've almost dreamed of it. I've had these sort of visions, and suddenly it's there, and I can't believe it's there. And a friend of mine who owns a publishing house in London came round with a pal, and then his friend asked, well, don't you have to have lots of money to collect things? And I said, no, you just got to collect things other people don't want. You've got to be ahead of the curve. So instead of collecting good poetry, you should try to collect bad poetry. And the owner of the publishing house said, oh, you should go to Faber and Faber. They've got a warehouse full of bad poetry. Like, oh, ouch.
No comment.
But I can see we've got our cursor's disappeared, which is really annoying. So if we stop sharing, we can go back to our camera, and then we should be able to see the chat. So please do type. So Martin has typed, for collectors of sci-fi and fantasy, which British book fair do you recommend if only one trip is practical? The main difference in England, and I suppose probably different names, but in America as well, you have the high-end book fairs and the low-end book fairs. The highest end book fair is called Firsts now at the Saatchi Gallery. It is, if you want to buy the very best copies at the very highest prices, and you're prepared to, it's a good fair to come to. But there's not as much in the way of discovery. Everything is very well curated, but a lot of the discovery has already been done for you. And for some customers, that is appropriate, and for some people, it isn't. That's more the world that I work in. But Jess goes often to the York Book Fair, which perhaps you can talk about that.
Yeah, I think so. The highest end book fairs probably in the world are New York and London. And California is up there as well. And so you will see at those fairs the most amazing books that are for sale in the world right now. So you'll see Gutenberg Bible leaves, you'll see inscribed Origin of Species, you'll see literary manuscripts, you'll see first editions of the best books, the best canon books. But yeah, the York Fair, which happens in September every year, has a huge number of British and international dealers who go to it, and it is jointly run between the provincial trade organization here, which is called the PBFA, the Provincial Book Fair Association, and the ABA, which is the Antiquarian Booksellers Association. And so you get dealers who deal across the absolute spectrum in terms of cost. So at the York Book Fair, you can buy, a wealth of nations for £10,000, but you can also buy a sort of penguin, like an interesting penguin, for £5. So I think that's one of my favorite book fairs. I think if you're starting out as a collector, or if you really know what it is that you collect and that you want, you have a really good idea, I think there's a lot of treasures to be found at York. And the other thing is, if you're coming over for a trip, it's great to center it around a book fair, but also it's worth it to just come and visit bookshops. Like, people are always happy to show you around. They're happy to pull stock for you if you're interested in it. We're just having a comment from Matt, who says that he was recently in London and came and chatted to people at Jarndyce and Meg's. Like, we really are happy to, most book dealers are happy to meet people and to help you find things, and say, we sort of touched on this a little bit, but or maybe we didn't, but like, bookselling is really, we're not really competitors. I mean, Ben and I are, obviously we work for different firms, but like, it's a pretty collegiate world. So I think a lot of dealers will say like, oh, we don't really have that, but I can call Mags, or I can call someone to see, if they have that. We do that all the time. So I think just, the key is to have good relationships with dealers, and then that's sort of but yeah, the York Book Fair is amazing. Go to it. It's really fun. And there's great bookshops in York as well.
Exactly.
There's also quite a cathedral there in York, is there not?
It's one of the best cities in the UK. Yeah. So the cathedral's amazing. It's a really old medieval city. There's great pubs, and it's really fun.
Yeah. So I one of the questions that came up to me when just hearing you talk about your cataloging, Jess, it seems to me the amount of scholarship that you have to bring to bear putting together a catalog, and it's not just accurately describing the item, but it's putting it into the context of its when it was issued, how its importance, and then the catalogs themselves become quite valuable as a resource for institutions. I just wonder if there are some institutions that do collect the catalogs that are produced by Mags and Jarndyce and other major dealers. I'm sure some people do collect catalogs. They're fascinating. I love to read them, but as a collection and for scholarship purposes, I wonder whether that's a field that is mined.
Well, almost the greatest resource that we have, and it's scholars will come to us and ask, and I'm very happy to oblige whenever it's possible, is the original auction catalogues. And so we have a run of all of the Sotheby's and all of the Christie's and others auction house catalogues. And they are the marked copies, our own marked copies. They're Ernest Maggs's copy when he went to the auction and marked down who bought what and how much for. And so there will be annotations throughout saying Quaritch bought this, Sovereign bought that. And just like I still do now, sometimes he will write, man at the back in the spectacles bought this, which isn't very helpful 150 years later. But it is a wonderful resource. And I'm working on trying to get those digitized by Senate House, because I think that that information should be out there. And so there is a lot. And catalogue wise, the institutions definitely do. They
keep them for reference. So a lot of feedback that Jarndyce gets is that, like I said, we do these really in-depth subject catalogs that do become sort of bibliographies in their own right. And you'll often see in bibliographies, this reference comes from Jarndyce. And it's also because of just, again, the access that we have. So the name of my firm, Jarndyce, is a reference to Bleak House. My boss is a Dickens expert. And his sort of personal collection is he owns every first edition Dickens book in cloth and in each cloth variant. So that's probably the only collection in the world like that. So he knows, right? He can say, oh, this was published first in this cloth, then in this, then in this. And that information goes into the catalogs. And just anecdotally recently, when I did the first Romantics catalog, which I did during lockdown, I was cataloging Byron. I cataloged probably 400 Byron items. There were loads of piracies, and there's no kind of definitive Byron bibliography. There's like various ones that aren't very good. And I got a lot of feedback after that catalog being like, would you consider writing a Byron bibliography? Because basically the work is like partly done. And my answer to that was absolutely not. But, you know, I kind of appreciate the, but yeah, no, I think that the catalogs are a really amazing resource. And a lot of booksellers are scholars. I think, you know, we have our sort of pet projects that we know a lot about. And if you have, you know, you have sort of all of those people in a firm that then when you put that knowledge together in catalogs, it's a pretty amazing resource.
And something to add to that is the criteria that booksellers use to catalogue are completely different to the criteria for librarians. And we will note things that librarians don't. And so, for example, the presence of a dust jacket. If you go through library catalogues trying to establish if their copy has a dust jacket or not, it's impossible. They don't record it. And they often will not record illustrations. They often won't record annotations. All the things that matter most to booksellers are things that libraries often forget. And so that makes bookseller catalogues very important, because they give you a real insight into the condition of the book, number of copies of this book, and variations, and yeah.
Yeah, and just again, like, this is something we can talk about for so long, but also because we add, like, the great luxury of bookselling is time. Because we need to sell things, we can spend the time picking apart all the interesting things about something that makes it saleable. And so I think, yeah, that's sort of, you know, like Ben said, there's just loads that isn't in a library catalog that we're saying, like, this is why this book, and also because we record scarcity. So oftentimes booksellers will say the last time this sold at auction was, you know, in 1905, and it sold for $3 or whatever, you know, like it, they are just a huge font of knowledge. I think there's a really interesting question in the chat box from Peter Tilp, that I think is something Ben and I are both really passionate about. I'm very glad to hear that you had good experiences at Megs and Jarndyce. I think, yeah, hopefully that's nice to hear. But I think that the younger generation of booksellers do interact differently with customers. I think we're very aware that for a long time, book collectors were kind of older people who were looking for specific things. And the reality is that when the internet, when books started, because book selling was a very early sort of business on the internet, and suddenly things got, excuse me, a lot less rare, because you could see every other copy. Like, it used to be that, you know, maybe there were 50 copies of something in America and 10 over here, but the one that you knew existed was the one that was in the paper catalog you got. And all of a sudden you have Abe Books or and you can just, or Via Libri or whatever, and you can see all the books for sale. So I think we kind of understand that we're providing a service, and it's like, we are book people, right, ultimately. And so I think we just love meeting other book people, and I think, yeah, like, some of my favorite collectors sort of never spend more than £50, but they always buy really, really interesting things, and, you know, their collections are really inspiring and very cool. And so I think you have, of course, we have customers who have very big budgets and can buy lots of stuff, and that's great, and their collections are fun and interesting too. But yeah, there's a whole spectrum that we're really happy to work with.
That's a question.
So are you seeing some? Oh, go ahead, Tamara.
Well, like Jess mentioned, I did see her putting together a catalog several years ago, and I was fascinated at the long term. But I was wondering about Megs, because I've also been to your warehouse, and it's massive. And so how do you prepare your catalogs? You just pick a topic and then kind of go raiding through your warehouse, or what do you guys do?
No, the warehouse is a slightly difficult prospect. They're books that were put there because you didn't know what to do with them, and it's astonishing how valuable some books can be and how unvaluable other books can be. Not just, I mean, value depends on who you are, but for example, we happen to have inherited for some reason this very large collection of German 19th century books, which we do not have the slightest idea how to sell. And so there may or may not be value in there, but it doesn't feel quite worth our time at the moment to try to figure it out. And so Jarndyce is astonishing because Brian, the founder, is the best buyer of antiquarian books I've ever met. I've had the privilege to follow him around book fairs a few times, and if he looks at something and says, "Oh, I've never seen that before," you know you should buy it, because he has seen a lot of books, and so Jarndyce has this astonishing stock of really high quality books. Mags, I think we tend to, when we plan a catalogue, we will go out and buy for that catalogue, but it's quite a short-term thing. So we will plan a year or two ahead, and we will go out and look for things, and that's quite common in the book trade. It's probably more common, and so you can start to get a sense for what other dealers might be doing based on what they might be buying from you. You can pick up these patterns and think, I think that bookseller has a romantic catalogue coming out. And so we tend to do that, and it gets even sometimes, and you'll get this for collectors as well. Very exciting when you may want to not make it entirely obvious what you're doing. This is more common with collectors, but collectors will sometimes get people to buy on their behalf, so that others don't catch on to them. Folger would do this because he didn't want people knowing it was Henry Folger buying the folios, so he would sort of set up stooges to do his work for him.
Everyone still knew he was bad at it. Like, everyone was like, "Oh yeah, that's Folger for sure." Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really interesting question. So yeah, I'll plan a couple of years ahead, and then I will go out and see. But you also, the other thing about it is there's a great, as always in all forms of book selling, there's this great sort of just coincidence. Things will fall into your lap sometimes, and you wouldn't have even sort of realised. And so we had this great fortune. It was the Queen's Platinum Jubilee earlier in the year, and a month before that, we happened upon a copy of Sangorski Sutcliffe made 20 copies of the book that she the Bible that she swore her coronation oath on, and a month before the Jubilee, we happened upon it, and then that was the basis for a Jubilee catalogue, which was only really sensible because we had this one great thing, and it just happened to fall into our laps at a certain time. And so, yeah, you also can't be too rigid, I think, about what your plans are. Sometimes somebody will walk in and they will have certain books, and okay, I think there's a catalogue in this. It deserves a catalogue.
And I think the thing too is that, and this is advice to collectors as well, is buy what you love. I mean, buy what you think is interesting. And because if you love something, if you think that it's interesting, as a bookseller, you can sell it. Because I can write and tell you, or stand at a book fair and tell you, like, this is why this is amazing. And so it's not as rigid as it seems. I think that sometimes you'll just see something, and like Ben says, you'll just go, I have to have it. And it doesn't really fit necessarily into what you're doing or the catalogs that you're planning, but you just know that it's fun and you want it. And so, and I think there is, you want to say, I have that, and you want to spend time with it and do research on it. And so I think we all end up with a lot of things that way. There is a lot of serendipity to it because, you never know what's going to come through the door. So,
And so you will find yourself for a few weeks becoming the world's expert. I had a lovely Mark Twain book, and I became an expert on Twain. But the problem with this is not the problem, but now every single Twain book that comes through the door, everyone, oh, Ben, you're the expert on Mark Twain, here you go. Sold one book once. But that's the way you learn. And of course, we, as Jess has been doing and was talking about, we sell a lot of collections to customers. And in that case, you are working for them almost, because one of the we have put out a wonderful collection of Oscar Wilde, and we put out a catalogue of which I'm happy to say we've sold, probably the greatest collection of books about the new woman in private hands, or no longer in private hands. And we're about to put out a catalogue in the same consignor of the Rhymers Club. And in all these cases, we are doing them as printed catalogues. The case of the New Woman, we had sold the catalogue, we had sold the collection before we printed the catalogue. But it's necessary to print the catalogue as a record of that collection. And so catalogues in that way don't just exist to sell. They also, I think we feel quite genuinely that they are part of sort of a service that we're offering to the customers, but also to the future. And I think that ties into the question about libraries collecting our catalogues. I think it means a lot to us when scholars reference our work. Means that we've sort of done something beyond just making money.
The collector themselves, I mean, whoever had that collection is no doubt very proud to have a catalog of that collection, as they don't have the collection anymore, but they have the catalog, the evidence of it. I know Marty Green, one of our members out here in Washington, who collected Arctic and Antarctic material, had a fabulous collection, and it was sold, and the catalog was just fabulous. Yeah, and he was, and he participated in putting that catalog together. Obviously, because the collector often has a lot of the knowledge that you need to have in order to put the catalog together. If you really had a knowledgeable, engaged collector.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I think it's important to say, when you're buying books, it's very important to trust booksellers. And one way of going about that is to talk in the trade, is to get around, to chat, to get a feel. So it's important that you trust people, but it's also, when you're selling a collection, it's very important that you sell it to the right people, that you trust them, and that they will do a proper, respectful job. I've seen some terrible things. There was an auction of a poet's library this year, which has been torn apart by an auction house into lot by lot by lot. And we were given the job, we were commissioned by an institution to try to save as much of the archive as possible. And these jobs are very difficult when you get given, it's one of the hardest jobs that we face. You give them a total pot, they will say, we have £50,000. We want you to get as much of this archive as you can, but you're bidding on individual lots. And you don't know what they're going to go for. And so you're keeping this running tally as the auction's going on of how much money you've got to spend, how hard should I go on this item, when should I let this go to save that money. And it's really difficult, and it's a thing that could and should be avoided. That auction house should never have sold it in that way. They should have gone straight to an institution and brokered a deal. And sometimes it's greed, and sometimes it's incompetence. So yeah, it's very important that you go to the right people, and that they produce these things. And I once went to a house he'd been a vicar in England, London, amazing big house, and full of books, but the shelves were about half empty, and you could tell by inference what was missing. So there would be some, not very valuable and reference books about the 1890s, and then a gap. You think, I think that's where the Oscar Wilde was, and so on and so forth. And as I was about to leave, another bookseller walked in, and they said to me, coincidentally, anecdotally, I think I've been here before. And it turned out that the house had been squatted by people before, and they had called in booksellers and sold stuff. And this person's collection then had been distributed with no record of it having been his collection. And I saw on the floor the original drawing for his bookplate. And builders were coming in and taking stuff out, and they said, "Oh, just take it. You know, nobody wants that." And so I took that home, and you know, that's almost sort of the only record of his collecting and of his passion. And I found that really, really moving and very sad. And so that's something that we always strive to do, is to sort of maintain the integrity of the collection, or a record of the integrity, one way or the other.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I mean, I don't know if people have this sort of perception, but like I think most book dealers, you know, 9 out of 10 book dealers don't get into it for the money, right? Like, books can be valuable, but we don't make a lot of money really. So there has to be a sort of driving force behind that. And I think for a lot of us, you know, it is the books and it's the history and it's the stories, and it's really powerful.
Yeah.
Those stories, the stories of, you know, a collection tells a story of someone's life, and it's really it's a great honor to work with like the collection that I was just working on last week. I mean, she has collected that for 60 years. You know, she's in her 90s, and what an honor to be able to speak with her about it and to be able to work with it. So we know that it's a massive privilege, and to get that sort of insight into people's lives, it's really special.
And I think the trade has moved on. I think that there is some truth to the stories of dodgy booksellers. There is some truth to that in the early 20th century. There are some very interesting characters. My dad was apprenticed, when he first joined the firm, to a man called Mr. Lent, who was singularly unqualified for being a bookseller by virtue of hating not only customers but also books. And he sat in the front room smoking endless cigarettes. And to this day, you know a book that was in the room when Mr. Lent was there, because it smells, you know, it's completely suffused with cigarette smoke. And there are some great sort of Dickensian stereotypes of disreputable booksellers who are completely ignorant about books, which I'm happy to say does, you know, no longer really pertains.
Yeah, there's just a great comment. Someone has asked a question saying that they, Jay Wing, that you're a novice, and is there much to explore in medical history books in London and in North America? Yes, so much. It's such a fascinating field. It is really widely collected. So medical history can be very, very expensive, very valuable. So I think the thing to do is to kind of start looking at particular bits that you're interested in, find sort of little pathways, rather than just like, I want to own Harvey's Treatise on the Blood, or evolution or whatever. Like or not evolution, but yeah, I mean, it's like Vesalius anatomy drawing, all that. Yeah, people love it. It's a really interesting part of collecting, but they can be fairly expensive, very expensive. So I think find the sort of niche that you're most interested in and start looking. I always tell people to start looking for pamphlets. There's so much information in pamphlets. That was like the way to communicate before the internet, hundreds of years. The first ideas of things were put in pamphlets. So little short, bits starting early, they were really like the English Civil War, which is my area of expertise, was fought with pamphlets as much as it was, sort of fought with weapons. So, ditto the sort of Protestant Reformation. So yeah, definitely look for sort of shorter disbound things is such a great starting point into especially historic collecting. Sort of pre 1900 collecting is a really good way to start. But yeah, medical history is such an interesting field. Yeah.
I've got to say, Jessica and Ben, both of you, maybe there's not a lot of money to be made in what you do, but I can tell you it really does sound exciting, interesting. As you said earlier, every day is going to be different. You never know what's going to come in. And it can just be really thrilling sometimes to handle some of these items that are in some cases just extremely important to us as human beings and our culture. I wonder if there's anything that do you collect individually, or do you consider it a kind of a conflict with being a dealer?
I think it's Jess looks at me because you can see the books behind us.
Yeah, I do see some books.
We are the constables and things. I think it's good not to collect the same things that you sell, but I personally find it quite helpful I like to experience it from both sides. I like to feel the passion for collecting as well, as I think it makes one a better dealer. But also I love books, and anyway, which is a long way of saying that I do collect. And a good example of sort of customer-dealer relationships was when our good friends at Quaritch put out a list for a book fair, and I got an email and I phoned them up immediately and said, Donovan, can I ask about an item on your list? And he said, Ben, item 42, it's available, you can have it. And I didn't have to say what it was. He knew immediately what I was phoning about, which was the first ever book of bicycle poetry, published in 1883 by a man whose only other claim to fame is having burned down the principal of Harvard's house, and thereby being expelled. He had a great passion for bicycles and a passion, however, ill-advised for poetry. And he wrote a letter to all the great American poets of the day asking him to write poems about bicycles, because he thought, bicycles are great, they're so cool. Why doesn't anyone else like bicycles? Only Oliver Wendell Holmes replied. But he didn't let that stop him, so he wrote all the poems himself. But he
signed their names.
He signed people's names, but as puns. So you get William Shakespeare, and it's absolutely awful.
It has expanded on Ben's passion for bad poetry as well, but it's really.
But I love this because there's this great earnestness in it, and I do have one to hand, which is. I say to hand.
Also, for people who didn't hear, Ben and I are in the process of moving, so we don't actually shelve our books in piles on our dining room table. We promise. It's just
we don't normally.
They need to be packed up.
Okay.
So he said he has one thing. He has 5 things.
5 things. Okay, I know. But this does help summarize some of this. So John, because it's talking about cheap print. What I find really interesting about this as a period of my specific collecting is literature, novels, poetry about bicycles from about 1880 to about 1910. Probably ends with H.G. Wells' Wheels of Chance. That's when it starts getting sort of cool or uncool. But it's really interesting because the bicycle was, for 10 years, incredibly trendy, popular, and then it completely disappeared. And so all of the material that had been, all of the books that had been written about it disappeared as well. And so you will find these copies where there will be only 1 or 2 copies in libraries in the world, or none. And this one, I think there are none at all. So this is The World on Wheels. This is a railway novel. It's got a W.H. Smith stamp, blind stamp in the back. So this format was sold in railway stations. It's tall and skinny, so you can put it in your jacket pocket. They're trying to appeal to people commuting into work in the city. What's really interesting about it is you've got a young woman on the cover wearing bloomers. It's not dated, but it must be late 1890s based on the style. And in this time, there were these big discussions about what was called rational dress for women, whether it was polite for women to wear, anything that wasn't a long ankle-length skirt. And she, by looking like this, by being on the bicycle, she is clearly identifying herself as what was called a new woman. She was a radical. She was making a statement that she didn't, as the book says, it begins with 4 women making a pact in their flat to never marry and saying, we don't need men. We're liberated women. And there are many books like this. There were very, very important books written by feminists, and and they're fascinating things. And when I first bought this, I thought that's what this was. And then for the first 2/3 of the novel, it goes along, straight faced, and then there's this sort of denouement. And by the end, all 4 women have given up the pact. They've all got married, they've all had children, and it ends with them saying, "Oh, how silly we were to think that we didn't need men." And so this is it's a trap novel. They're trying to sell it to young women who will be lured into thinking it's a novel about liberation, only to sort of have their morals corrected by the end. So I find that really, really interesting. But the other side, the genuine article, this is Wheels and Whims and Etching. Again, a very scarce book. It's about 3 women who go on a tricycle holiday in 1880 in Connecticut. And it starts with them getting on their tricycles, putting on sunglasses, tucking pistols into their belts and cycling into the distance, which for 3 women in 1880 in Connecticut is absolutely astonishing. And then most of them are romances. So Under Fate's Wheel, this young woman, I think there's murder and there's drama and there's love. And, this is typical of sort of cheap Holbrook sauce. I find this so interesting. This is what your average Edwardian would be reading for fun. And so I think especially with periods when there's a lot of material published, it's a really interesting thing to take a small slice of it, a sort of a cross-section slice, whatever it is that you're looking at. That it's too big, the field is too big to look at it all. But if you just dig into one slice, you can discover so many things about people, about how they read, what they read, why they read.
Yeah, I often tell people when they start collecting, you can go about it 2 ways, right? You start really wide. So you just say, I really like single volume novels from this period or whatever. And then you'll find what you like through the collecting process, and it'll get smaller and smaller and more specific. Or you start really specific and then you go out because you think, actually, I want to know why that is like that and why that's like that. So I think Ben is a very keen cyclist and also sort of, an expert really in turn of the century. And so that's kind of a perfect example of collect what you, those sort of niches. And I collect what I like. So I have quite a good collection of sort of Agatha Christie pulp paperbacks, which are a particular sort of pet love of mine, which are not on the dining room table. And then also Ben and I often buy books for each other as gifts. And so I have quite a good private press collection that are gifts from Ben, which is great because I don't deal in them, but they're just really beautiful things. And then I've gotten Ben some sort of choice early books that I just think, one should have in your library, like an early edition of Paradise Lost and stuff like that, So.
And it should be said that all booksellers have this, I think probably every bookseller has a slightly amorphous notion of what stock belongs to the bookshop and what stock belongs to them.
It's slightly different when you don't own the bookshop, it should be said.
Yeah, but even
my employers have pretty strong ideas about what belongs to them and what belongs to me. Yeah.
But you do find often with booksellers when they pass away, astonishingly interesting collections that are in their private property, because these are people who will have seen millions of books in their career. So anything they choose to keep for themselves probably stands out as being profoundly unusual, profoundly interesting, and eclectic, and often probably not valuable at the time, but that's the sort of thing that can become valuable later on. And Brian is like this. I mean, maybe not you, but I know that Jess's boss has some wonderful books that he was able to collect by virtue of buying them in the 1960s and the 70s, and to put those collections together now would be, you know, millions of pounds, and those are absolutely astonishing, and that's by virtue of just, you know, going up and down in London. You used to have these bookstores, the Portobello, the book markets, and you could discover astonishing things.
Yeah. We actually, the catalog that I'm about to start doing, I think it's going to be 3 catalogs probably, which is, I said, spoke a little bit about earlier, which is detective, fiction, mystery, and sci-fi. My boss has been collecting those books for 55 years, and we've never done a catalog of them. So they're all completely fresh stock. We've never sold any of them. We've never offered them for sale. They're just in the Jarndyce basement, sort of as this treasure trove. So that's really exciting. And the collections, again, my boss Brian just has a phenomenal eye for a book. So he sort of collected yellowbacks before, which is again cheap railway fiction, books in original boards, and in original cloth, like the books that weren't kind of sexy and people weren't buying 40 years ago. And now those are the books that people want in their original condition, in their original bindings, which Brian just had a real foresight for. So we're very lucky. Yeah.
One of our members, one of our new members, the book club, collects Rex Stout, and he's written a very nice article about how he got into collecting, particularly Rex Stout. And so he's got, you can't really see very much of it here, but it's in our latest journal, which has a great cover called The Abominable Snowman. We have another of our collectors has quite a collection of material on the Abominable Snowman and Yetis and things, creatures like that. So anyway, it's a wonderful world out there in books. I can't tell you how much I really enjoyed this, and I'm sure everybody that attended has enjoyed your discussion and where it kind of led you into different ways. Just talking about it today, you're so knowledgeable, so interesting, and again, thank you. Thanks a lot.